Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of The Pulse with BP. I'm your host, Billy Parvatam. I'm pleased to be joined by quite possibly our biggest guest so far, none other than Adam Amin, a guy who recently became a sports broadcaster at Fox Sports. In fact, he was a longtime ESPN broadcaster for years before that. He's done just about everything you can do in the business, a host of different sports at ESPN, including calling the WNBA and the women's NCAA tournament, baseball, football, the host of them, and just recently moved to Fox Sports where he'll be doing the NFL as well as baseball. Adam zooms in from Chicago today. Adam, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, BP. Appreciate it.
So, Adam, I wanted to start with, when did you realize you wanted to become a sports broadcaster?
It wasn't like a lot of the people that I knew coming up in the business. I feel like a lot of those people that I got to meet all knew they wanted to do this way before I ever did. So, they were talking about, I was 7 or 8 years old and I knew this is what I wanted to do. I was 5 and this is what I knew what I wanted to do. And I wasn't that way. I didn't really realize this was a possible career until I was maybe 17 or 18, getting into high school, maybe around 16 or 17 years old, we got a chance to do some games on the public access station. So that was like my first foray into it. And it felt like it was something that I enjoyed, but never really thought of as like a viable option. And then once I got to college and I was told by a close friend of mine that was a few years older than me, hey, if you want to broadcast, if you want to try it, and try to make it something you pursue in college, like come to Valpo in Northwest Indiana, and I'll, help get you on the radio. And I was confused. I had really no idea what I wanted to do going out of high school. So this was an option. And I was like, all right, let's give this option a shot and see if anything comes of it. And it became something I was very passionate about, and it just kind of developed from there. So not really until I was 17 or 18 that I figured out that this is what I wanted to do.
So let's get the elephant out of the way. You, of course, being a South Asian American man, ethnicity Pakistani, my ethnicity is Indian. When you were growing up and like you said, you got to high school, you realized maybe this is something that you wanted to do for a career. Did it ever dawn on you that there weren't a lot of guys that looked like you in the business?
Not really. It didn't really register to me. I didn't think about it that much because I didn't see it. I didn't think about it because there was no real representation. So it wasn't anything that I directly thought, oh, well, I can't do this, or people who look like me can't do this, but it doesn't click right away. It doesn't really register that, if you don't see somebody who looks like you or has a similar background as you doing a certain act, you don't really know that act pertains to you if you're looking at it through that prism. And I never really saw a lot of representation growing up. Certainly I didn't. And then, once you get a little bit older, I got into, like we were talking about, you get to 16, 17, 18 years old and really even a little older than that, probably into my 20s. Then I started to see people like Kevin Nagandi, Dari Noka, Anish Shroff a few years after that. So I saw more people who looked like me or had a similar background to me. Ravi Baichwal is an anchor in Chicago for ABC. He's Canadian and Pakistani, one of the rare, South Asian people I had seen on TV in general, let alone covering sports. So once you finally start to see it, it makes a little bit more sense, and you start to register those particular individuals as kind of benchmarks for yourself. So that's how I kind of thought of Kevin and Dari and Ravi. And then, when I started interning in Chicago at a radio station, I worked with Sahadev Sharma, who is now a writer for The Athletic, for the Cubs, Adam Abdallah, who's now a host at ESPN Radio in Chicago. These were, Adam's Egyptian, Sahadev is South Asian. So like it was finally starting to click that I could do this and feel a connectivity. I didn't feel like I didn't have to, or I didn't feel like I had to pursue this and have people that looked like me doing it, because I enjoyed the act. I enjoyed the job itself. I enjoyed broadcasting so much that I think I was going to do it regardless, or at least try to do it. But when you see people who come from your background or look like you or have similar upbringings and things like that, to have that register now gives you a little bit more connectivity to the business. It almost makes you feel like you have a little bit more ownership in it.
Were you ever surrounded by people that said that you couldn't do it? I mean, everybody goes through trials and tribulations, ups and downs in their career. Were you ever surrounded by people, whether it was friends, whether it was family, that maybe gave you a hard time, said that, this was a foolish dream, that you couldn't do it, anything like that?
I mean, there was some family who thought this was kind of, there were, I don't even want to say they thought it was foolish. I think they were skeptical is probably the right way to say it. And understandably so. It is a difficult business overall. It's a difficult industry to get to a high level. It's hard. But that should be, in my head, you kind of justify it, by going, well, if it's hard, it should be worth it, right? Like, of course it's hard. It's supposed to be difficult. And I got a lot of healthy skepticism from a good place too. Like, it was from a place of genuine concern for your well-being and things like that. Like, hey, we want to make sure you're going to be doing okay. It is a competitive business. It's low paying, when you start off in this business, which again, when you're South Asian, kind of comes with the territory a little bit. I guess it is a little bit of a stereotype, and you can spin it positively or negatively, however you want to perceive it. You can say, well, it's negative because you're being limited by maybe your culture, by what your parents see as a narrow scope of what you're capable of. But it's also a positive in the sense of they want to drive you towards something that is a little bit more stable. Like, that's understandable. That's again, it comes from a good place. But I think I got to a point where the passion I had for trying it and to continue to do it and pursue it was enough to kind of overcome any of the skepticism that I was getting. And it came from my brothers. It came from my mom. My dad was understandably a skeptic of it, but also was very supportive in that sense, saying, like, if you believe that you really want to do this, like, just don't half-ass it. Like, if you give everything you have to this, I have faith that things will work out for you. Like, I think he had faith that I was, I wouldn't jump into something if I didn't feel strongly about it. And kind of having that almost inherent blessing was enough for me to know that it was okay to pursue this.
You mentioned your father. How important was his support? Because I, recently read your piece that you wrote for him a few years back. And, talking about his support, you write about how you called him and told him that, you got a job offer from ESPN. And he said, well, I always expected you to get this point. How important was his support to you as you made your way up in the business?
Yeah, I remember my first full-time job out of college was a 500-mile drive to Spirit Lake, Iowa. It was about a 7 or 8 hour drive, and parents being who they are, even if they're not fully convinced about the path that you're taking, are willing to travel the path for a little while with you. So that was, I remember them driving right behind me on this 7.5, 8 hour drive in the, heading towards Northwest Iowa, this small town, and they helped move me into my apartment. And I think I just appreciated that they were at least willing to show that, they were willing to give me a little bit of that support, even if they didn't wholeheartedly understand or agree with why I was going into this job or whatever it may have been. So having that support just meant a lot, and having their understanding that if I was going to pursue something else, or if I was going to, change jobs at some point, it'd be for good reason. And I think they also had enough faith and trust in me that I'd figure something out or I'd make it work. And even that alone was enough. Just having that alone was enough to convince me, okay, you can do this. You can do this.
How do we change the culture? I mean, I'm sure you probably talk to people. There's still, many people in the South Asian community that I'm sure want to get into sports broadcasting, but are not able to because of, family support or a host of other factors. I mean, how do we change the culture in our community?
I think the representation part of it is pretty big. I think just having a chance to see people who look like you or have that similar background, to have, your parents see that and say, hey, look at this person, look at that person, look at that person. The reason a lot of people get into this business is because they have somebody locally that they really admire, or, there's a sports broadcaster that they really like that calls games for their team, and maybe just even if it's not a direct connect that you see right out of the gate, it's to have at least some feeling of representation where, oh yeah, people who look like me or people who are from where I'm from can do this job. And I would imagine it's very similar in a lot of industries where it's, mainly dominated by one community, so to speak. I feel like it's hard to feel ownership in that unless you really feel passionate about it, strongly about it, or you have some level of representation. And I think the times are gonna change gradually. I think more people feel like they can get into sports in general as a career, whether it's as a broadcaster, whether it's doing podcasts, whether it's doing analysis, whether it's writing about it. I think there are so many more opportunities now that people who are on the periphery of that, oh, I like writing or I like podcasting, and I happen to like sports. Maybe I can implement both of those things together into a pursuit. I think the more avenues that open up, naturally, you're going to get more people from multiple backgrounds who have a different entry point into getting into sports or sports broadcasting or writing or whatever it may be. There's more entry points into it. So naturally, you're going to get a wider base of people. But if you do see people read, the work of people that do have some level of connectivity to you and at your core, where you're from, ethnicity, ethnic background, maybe it's a religious thing, whatever it may be, whatever part of your culture is represented somewhere in an industry, you're going to be able to latch onto that if you want to and say, well, that guy did it, that woman did it, they look like me, I know I can do it too if I wanted to. I think just having the option of that be a little bit more apparent and a little bit more accessible is honestly enough to start driving more people of different communities into these positions and into these industries.
And speaking of the representation, I mean, you mentioned some of the names earlier. You've got yourself now, Adnan Virk, Kevin Nagandi, Anish Sharap, Zubin Mehenti. Entertainment, you've got Sam Minaj, Kal Penn, Sanjay Gupta. I mean, it's not all losing battle, right? We do see a decent amount of people still representing us out there in the entertainment world.
Yeah, I think so. And again, it's just feeling like that's a position that you can have someday if that's intriguing to you. If you're into what Kal Penn has done in his career as an actor, and you go, man, I why can't a brown dude be a leading man in a comedy or in a movie or be a supporting role on a very popular television show or be the lead in a television show, whether it lasts or not. It's just seeing a story that you might be able to relate to play out in a forum that maybe wasn't as accessible to you for whatever reason. Again, it might be visual, it might be cultural, any roadblocks can pop up. But once you kind of see one or two elements of you in a position, that hurdle seems like it's a lot easier to jump over, or it doesn't seem as daunting to have to move past something like that. I don't think, I think it's probably very individualized, like your personality, your experience, your background, how you were brought up, how you think. All of those things will play a role into your perception of anything. If you think television is a viable job, then you're going to say, well, I want to pursue that. Is there any evidence of being able to pursue that? And you see people like Kal Penn, you see Hassan Minhaj, like you see them on TV doing important work, like major work that a lot of people latch onto and care about. One thing you mentioned, Hassan, I love this show, Patriot Act. And when it was canceled, unfortunately, I basically thought that this guy gave us a voice on a global stage, talking about global issues, talking about global economics and problems that are visible to every community, but came at it from our community. And that makes me feel like we have a voice in that discussion. Not that we didn't before. it's not like we were being shut out necessarily, but when you see somebody at a high level, perhaps one of the highest levels, getting a television show on Netflix is a big deal. It's a big deal to anybody. And a lot of people watch it, have subscriptions to it, myself included. So it is something that carries value and weight. So anytime we can be associated with something that has value and weight, we now feel like we're a part of it. We now feel like we can participate in it. And now that leads to unique perspectives, unique voices, unique entry points into various, I guess, disciplines that maybe we weren't really thinking about as viable options 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago.
Do you still face stereotypes when you travel for games in the booth? I mean, you've been hired. You were hired at ESPN in 2011, just recently with Fox Sports. Obviously, you're not traveling as much now, but do you still face stereotypes whenever you go travel? Do people say certain things, or is that kind of faded out as you've become more established in the business?
I mean, establishment comes, when I get to where I got to go to work. Like when I come into Blacksburg, I know the staff at Virginia Tech. I know the coaching staff. I know some of the people that work around the program. So I don't ever feel like that's the case. And part of that is probably, as you said, Billy, establishment. I've been doing this long enough to where if I were to go back to Virginia Tech or go back to North Carolina or go, to Wisconsin or go to UCLA or USC for a football game, then I wouldn't have much of an issue because I've been there. They know me, they just know who I am because I've come in and done their games before and they've treated me well. And I hope I've treated them the same. So naturally that's going to be easy. That's a piece of cake. Traveling around, getting into, smaller towns, maybe in the South, like, do I have some concern? Maybe, so depending on the situation, depending on what time of day it is, like, am I by myself? Like, I do worry about those things, but I also don't feel like I've ever been somebody who's going to bother anybody anyway. I'm not a particularly intimidating individual, so I don't think I'm that much of a threat to anybody. I'm not, I'm a fairly boyish looking person, I think, other than the beard. So, like, again, I'm not going to walk into a room and intimidate anybody. So I think that's probably part of it too. But I've felt it in certain ways. I've had people, security guards at stadiums say things to me that I felt uncomfortable with. And I don't want to judge them because I don't know what their intent was, but I know how it made me feel. Like I'm not assuming that they were thinking something, that I was going to do something wrong, but their tone in questioning, the way they kind of, speak to you, I don't know, maybe they speak to everybody that way, but I know how it made me feel. It made me feel less than when I'm questioned as to what I'm doing at a stadium when I pull up to the parking lot. Like if you're going to aggressively question me, which has happened before, then I'm naturally going to feel like this person thinks I'm doing something wrong. And I don't necessarily think that's specific to me. I think that's specific to, or that's a general thing for a lot of people who get questioned for one reason or another. And if they've been questioned about something specifically because of their skin color, because of their background, because they don't look like they belong, when they've been asked about that various times in their life, multiple times in their life, and it happens again, that feeling is going to feel the same no matter what. You're going to feel less than, you're going to feel like less than yourself. And I've had those moments. I've had plenty of those moments. I hesitate to judge the people that say the things that they've said because I don't know if they treat everybody that way because it's their job. I've heard that a lot too. Like once you kind of walk through who you are or what you're doing there and what your role is, they go, hey, listen, man, I was just doing my job. And at the end of the day, maybe that is the case. I just know how I felt when you were trying to do your job and it made me feel not great. So it's a hard balance to walk because you want to it's hard not to take those things personally because it feels like an affront to you as a whole person, even though that may not be the case, even though that may not be what the other person is intending. But those feelings are something I do battle. I'm sure I'm not the only one who feels that way. And it is a difficult balance to strike by trying not to take these things too personally, but also understanding that There are people who will look at you for a very specific reason that is a part of your core being, and they will question that, and that sucks. That's the best way I can try to articulate it without making assumptions about people that I wouldn't want made about myself.
And given your platform, I mean, I follow you on Twitter. You're very active on Twitter, willing to engage with, just about anybody. How do you, navigate this sort of balance of, of people saying, someone like you in your position, stick to sports, but you being a brown man in America, everything going on, you obviously follow what's going on. You want to make sure your voice is heard. How do you navigate that balance? Because, I've seen some of the DMs that you've posted, to Twitter. I mean, you get all kinds of stuff all the time. So how do you find a way to walk the balance of, speaking out as a brown man on the topics going out, but not alienating your audience? Or is that something you don't even really think about?
I think now it's to the point where, the stick to sports thing is kind of dissipating fast, just in general. I think we've all gotten to the point where we realize that while they don't have to intersect at all times, which I think some people kind of have the assumption or the perception that, well, now it's fully ingrained with one another and fully entrenched with one another. I don't know if that's necessarily the case. I think when we turn on a game, especially us as broadcasters, when we turn on a broadcast, we start calling a game that we've prepared for. I just want to call the game. I want to get through the game. I put a lot of work into preparing for that game and the elements that I've always had to prepare for to be able to call a game professionally. So I want that to be at the forefront of what we discuss. I want that escape too. We have lots of polling and data and surveying that talk about what sports is to people. And I think the two biggest things are escapism and unity. Those are the two things that sports provide for sure. But I think we also have an understanding that there are some edges of sports that are seeing politics, if you want to call it that. Again, I have a hesitation to even call some of the things that we're discussing in the sports world political. I think Doc Rivers talked about this a little bit as well and said, this isn't a politics issue. This is a human rights issue. When they're talking about social injustice, when they're talking about Black Lives Matter, it's a social issue. It is a human issue rather than a political one. I understand that a lot of people feel strongly about it based on their party line or party identification. And again, that's a different discussion for a different day, whether that's the right thinking to go about it. But for us who are in sports, we want to focus on the sports too. We wish it weren't the case where these stories, these elements to what we're seeing, they're directly involved with the people who are playing the sports. And when these athletes use their platform and our job is to cover them, we can't pretend this stuff doesn't exist. And to tell stories on the air that supplement the overarching storylines that have kind of gripped this country over the last, 3.5, 4 months in particular, but obviously much longer than that. But in this last 4-month stretch in particular, you have to respect that their platform as well. They're using their platform for something. So we want to tell stories that have connectivity to that. So that's a tough balance to walk when you're on the air. And I think the best thing for us is to make sure I don't want to be spontaneous when talking about these things. If I'm going to speak about them, I want to speak about them intelligently. I want to be as neutral as possible on the air, regardless of my own feelings about it. But I want to be as neutral as possible. I want to help the positive aspects of what these athletes are doing. You want to help that because you do get to know some of these athletes and you get to know them as people, and you understand that this is something that they care about and they're putting a lot on the line to be able to discuss that and use their platform as well. And if we're covering the sport and these individuals, it's our job to make sure we touch on those things. Now, that's a long answer specifically about kind of how we approach it on air. Now, to go back to what you were talking about, Billy, with Twitter and social media and things like that, my own personal view of it, and this is a balance that I walk, and it changes, it fluctuates in terms of degrees and how I feel about it on a day-to-day basis probably. And Some days it depends on what's being discussed and what events have taken place. Sometimes your views, your reactions, your feelings can change on a day-to-day basis because of the volatility of some of the events that have taken place the last several months. For me personally, if I have a unique perspective to add, if I feel like I have something that I can bring to a conversation, in particular, if it's something that is positive, that is trying to, share something that is more unifying, that is more uniting than dividing, that's great. But I know that that's not how it's always going to be perceived. People are going to look at something you say and think, well, no, every experience that I've had on my end of things tells me that you're wrong. And that's what discourse unfortunately becomes in this era. And it's hard to do it on Twitter, and we all get caught in it. Like we want to say something meaningful because we do have a small platform, relative to the the entire internet. It's a small platform, but there are people that will kind of at least take time to listen, that come in from the other side of it. I've had productive DM conversations with several people who don't agree with me about something I might say, and we have a nice conversation on social media back and forth, whether it's publicly or privately. And I respect that. I can appreciate that. And maybe that's something you can do. If you can change one person's mind, maybe that's enough to keep you going and talking about certain things. But I also know that if I say something, I want to mean it. If I say something that I feel like has meaning to it, I want to be careful in terms of how I word it, because I don't want it to be misconstrued. I don't want it to be taken out of context. I want people to know exactly what I mean. And that's a hard line to balance. And when there is stuff to focus on, I'm not going to be worried about it as much. And when things are happening, unfolding in front of our very eyes, and they're staring at you in the face, it's hard to ignore those things. And that's kind of how I've approached it. When I feel compelled, based on my background, my individual experience, and hopefully a unique perspective that can be added to the conversation, then I'm willing to say something. Otherwise, I don't want to just assume I know more than anybody else.
And I wanted to go to something very specific that you said when you officially announced publicly that you were moving on to Fox Sports and the TV voice of the Chicago Bulls. You tweeted out, and first of all, it kind of shows the person you are, because, you mentioned in the tweet that you had that, you were hesitant to celebrate this personal success at a time of so much strife in our country. But you said that you decided to make donations to organizations in Chicago, We Got Us, and the Chicago Community Bond Fund, as well as donations to the Chicago Community Trust's COVID Response Fund, in order to hopefully be the start of trying to make change in the country. Why was it important for you to do that then?
It felt like this was probably one of the biggest moments of my professional life, and it would garner some attention based on that small platform that I do happen to have. And, when you announce things on Twitter, people do interact with you. And obviously, like, people who follow you are probably hearing this news for the first time through this platform. And it had come a few days after, I think, the George Floyd protests began, maybe the week following his passing. And that was weighing on a lot of people at the time. It was, it was maybe for the first time, it was something that was really stepping into the forefront of a national conversation for a lot of people. I know that that's not the first time we've discussed that. I've kept track of that for years, like, especially when you're a minority of any color, of any background, and something happens to a minority community. I think for a lot of us, our first thought is, would that happen to our community too? Are they going to look at people like us and treat us the same way that a fellow minority community feels like they're being treated? Are we going to feel that way too eventually? And that's part of the inherent nature of being a minority. When you grow up, me for 30 years, Billy, you for 20 some odd years, when you grow up as a minority in this country, there are more opportunities afforded to you than maybe there would be from your home country. That's why my father came to the United States. in the late 70s because he felt that there was more opportunity here and a chance to do different and great things. And I feel like I'm a testament to that, you know, as the son of an immigrant, of immigrants in general, and the first person in my family born in this country. I naturally have that positive outlook about this place because I know what it's been compared to for my family. When anything happens to a minority community, any minority community, naturally our antenna go up a little bit. You know, we perk up and think, hey, what's going on over there? Because we know what the precious nature of living in this country means. And I talked about it earlier, Billy, in that rambling answer about unique perspective. And this is the unique perspective that I come in with. It's not this. It's a common story for a lot of us, but not many of us have had this story and had this life and had this job track and have had this career and now have had this platform. I do feel like I'm one of the, you know, fortunate ones in that sense. So anytime something like that happens to any community, we're going to perk up and think about it. Whereas for a lot of people, when the George Floyd incidents happened and the protests began, it was the first time that a lot of people in this country, I would imagine, were being faced with it head on and had to face it head on. And not just from a minority community, from a majority community, from being white. I know a lot of white people had to address some things or think about some things that they really didn't have to think about or weren't necessarily compelled to think about until these last 4 or 5 months. So I think that's part of the reason that we do feel strongly about it. I think it's part of the reason that this has been such an important topic in the news for the last several months. It's because of the impact that it has on not just one community, but on a lot. And when we see how things could potentially play out, our concern levels naturally go up. And we want to try to understand as much of what's happening as possible. And again, if we have a unique perspective to add to it, the more people that we can at least open their eyes to the realities that certain people face that others don't, I think that's better for us as a people, as a country, and probably as a humanity in general. I think that's probably the catalyst for a lot of what we end up discussing, Billy. And I may not have answered your question fully there, so my apologies. But that's kind of the first thing that pops into my head when I think about, you know, the kind of addressing these things and discussing these things and seeing how they affect all of us in the long run. So again, it's not the easiest position to feel like you're in, to feel like, hey, I should probably talk about this, but if it's important enough to compel us to discuss these things and go out of our way to have important talks, I feel like these are conversations worth having.
A question that I've always wondered of sports broadcasters like yourself who are engaged, I mean, you follow what's going on in the news. Have you ever, or did you ever consider at any point in your career that you might want to do news? Was it something that ever crossed your mind, or was it always sports is my thing and I just prefer to be involved, but maybe not covering the news every day? Has that ever crossed your mind at all?
Yeah, I had a couple of chances to fill in, you know, on various news, projects, whether it was mostly in radio, certainly in college, and certainly in my first job, you had to dip into it a little bit. But my main focus has kind of always been sports in the most naive sense of the word. Like this is still, you know, something enjoyable for me to cover. And I know for a lot of people, it's jarring when you see athletes have these, you know, have messages on their jerseys, or it's written on the field or written on the court. I'm sure it's jarring for a lot of people, but that's just to keep your attention on it and to keep you thinking about it. At the end of the day, the athletes that are out there, and you hear LeBron talking about it, you hear James Harden, you hear Giannis, you know, all these NBA players have talked about, we love playing this game. That's why we're here. That's why we stepped away from our families. That's why we're living in this bubble, because we love this game. And certainly it provides for them, and it's their job, and they want to do it professionally and all that. But it's something they love to do. And it's the same for us who get to cover this. We love doing it. That's why all these NBA broadcasters have locked themselves in Orlando for the last couple of months. It's why, people in the NHL have done what they've done in Canada. It's, why people are willing to go to Houston or Texas or Southern California for a month during the, potential Major League Baseball bubble, for their playoffs. Like, people are willing to do this because they love it. And I do feel like still having that understanding as to why we like doing this job. It's the draw of it. It is the competition. It's the camaraderie that comes with sports, the respect that comes with sports. There is a winner and there is a loser, but it seems to be, at the end of the day, cordial. It seems to be unifying to people. That's why we love sports. So that's always what drew me to sports. It was an escape in a lot of ways for me. And news was sad. That I think that's the easiest way I could say it. For me, news was sad. I'm sure I've messed up this quote a million times and I can't even remember who says it anymore, but it's like, the front page of the newspaper features man's failures while the sports page celebrates man's triumphs. And that always rung, close to home for me. I liked celebrating the triumph of people rather than the defeat. And sports gives you a clear-cut opportunity to do that. Again, as these edges are a little bit rougher now, and as different elements and different parts of our lives start to permeate into sports, it's our job to try to cover those properly. And that's why I said earlier, I don't want to be spontaneous when it comes to that. That's one thing about news. You don't want to necessarily be spontaneous. You want to get the facts right. You want to be correct. It's so essential in journalism to be correct, to be factual rather than be first. And, that element, when it does come into sports, it's our job to take that same level of care with how we implement those stories into a sports scope. And that's very important. That's why I said earlier, I don't want to be spontaneous with those things. I want to speak to them, write to them, and broadcast them properly so that the information that's necessary for people to create their conclusions is there for them. And we're, working on figuring out how exactly to provide that in a new setting anytime we go out there to tell, these stories, especially in this current state that we're in.
I wanted to transition to something a little more lighthearted to close out our conversation. Do you have a favorite Indian or Pakistani food that you like to consume? Do you enjoy watching Bollywood movies, for example? I mean, are those things that you consume a lot? What's your take on that?
I consume a lot more of the food than I do the movies now. I can assure you of that. My mom still cooks a ton of food for us anytime we go by, so I have my fair share of biryani and samosa, and she makes a great nyati. So like her classic stuff. That's what I love to consume. I eat a lot less of it now than I did, 10 years ago. More so just to try to stay in shape and keep some kind of level of athleticism going. But the food aspect of our culture is probably the thing that prevails the most. It feels like home. There's a reason that people love their parents cooking, and anything mom makes still has that same taste and that same kind of sense memory that comes along with it. So the food a lot more. I grew up on Bollywood movies. Once you get into elementary school, you get into like 4th and 5th grade and junior high, it's not really cool to talk about Bollywood movies anymore. So, when I was, 12 or 13, I wasn't talking about Dancer or Juba or Sajan or anything like that. All very old movies in comparison to what I imagine people are watching now in Bollywood. But, the Amir Khans of the world and Salman Khan and Amitabh Bachchan and, watching these actors, these are leading men that you see as a kid, as a child. And that's cool, to me, to still feel like you had some sense of, you could still be at the forefront of something in media. That I don't think I probably haven't talked about that enough. And that's a really good question, Billy, because I probably haven't thought about the impact of even watching Bollywood movies as a kid. Because you do see that's maybe the first times I had seen people who look like me as the lead in a movie. You don't understand that as a 6, 7, 8-year-old kid, But now kind of looking back on it, you can kind of connect the dots and realize maybe that did have an impact on me. Maybe that did make me feel like I could stand in front of people and perform, which has been most of my life now, going back to playing the violin and performing in plays and theater and things like that. Maybe that was more influential than I gave it credit for at the time. So while I may not watch the way I used to, I still feel like maybe that there is some level of influence on me in a big way.
And my final question for you, Adam, again, thank you so much for your time in this conversation. And you, of course, are nowhere near this. You're in your 30s. You just made a big transition to Fox Sports. But when you retire and, they say on the news, if they say you were a pioneer in the business, you helped open the doors for South Asian Americans to pursue sports broadcasting, how would that make you feel?
Man, it's a great hypothetical to think about, right? And if it did turn out to be true someday, that would be very meaningful. It's a moving question, man. That's a really, really cool question for you to ask. I hope that that's the influence. I hope if there is any influence, it's positive, and that is clearly something positive for a community. And if I play a small role in that, that would be as meaningful as anything maybe I've ever done. And I didn't get into this thinking, as all this discussion that we've had, a lot of what we've talked about didn't really become clear to me until the last few years. I think you don't get into the business thinking of it that way. And obviously all these elements kind of maybe some of this is hindsight, and hindsight's typically 2020, but kind of seeing all these elements now and how they roll together into how all of the elements have shaped what I do now and how I go about my job, and hopefully how I go about my day-to-day life as just a person in this world. It didn't click until a few years ago. And it took, you and I have communicated a bunch of times in the last few years, and there have been other South Asian broadcasters who've reached out, and even South Asians who aren't broadcasters, who are maybe just sports fans. And, starting a few years ago when I had a little, bigger platform and doing bigger events and just being seen by more people based on the level of game we were calling, when you get messages with a Pakistani or an Indian flag, or you get a message saying Mubarak, brother, and it's people telling you you're the first, one of the first people I've seen that's us. It's one of the first times I've seen us out there. That's meaningful. That's meaningful now. And if it grew into something greater than that, and I got to play a small role in that growth, great. And if not, if I've made any influence on people, I'll take it at this point. I think that's the best we can ask for, is hope that whatever we do leaves behind some blueprint as to how to do the job professionally and how to do it well, regardless of who you are or where you come from. But if seeing somebody that looks like you, that, you and I have connectivity, you and I look like each other, you and I come from this, our parents come from the same country, we ate the same food yesterday, we listen to the same music, whatever it is. If that sparks something that makes people feel like they have an opportunity to do more than they thought initially, that's meaningful on a human level. Forget about the background in general, but the background of it adds more connectivity to it, and that's really meaningful.
Adam Amin, Chicago Bulls, Fox Sports. Can't thank you enough for your time today and chatting about so many important issues going on in both our community and the country. I want to tell our audience and the people who view this video, I told Adam this earlier, all this success that's happening could not happen to a better person. He's one of the best people I've met in the sports field and really just in general. So Adam, like I said to you earlier, could not be happier for your personal success. I'm excited to see where you go. You are a rising star in this industry, and especially supporting and representing our community. So can't thank you enough, and wish you all the best going forward.
No, I really appreciate it, man. Thanks for a really good conversation.
For Adam Amin, sports broadcaster, Fox Sports, Chicago Bulls, I'm Billy Parvatam. This has been the latest edition of The Pulse with BP. We thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.